Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Authors series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is Taking Care. We'll be celebrating all the ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our full upcoming schedule at wab.org. Tonight, we're so happy to have Corey Sobel with us. First, we'll hear from Corey, then he'll be in conversation with Kevin Nguyen, author of New Waves. You can purchase Corey's book at Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. Feel free to submit questions to the Q&A function. Corey Sobel's debut novel, The Redshirt, was a finalist for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize and one of NPR's favorite books of 2020. He is a graduate of Duke University, where he was a scholarship football player. He has reported on human rights abuses in Burma, served as an HIV/AIDS researcher in Kenya, and consulted for the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations. He has written for numerous publications, including HuffPost, Esquire.com, and Chapel Hill News. As the author Rion Amilcar Scott says, The Redshirt is not just a novel of great beauty, it is also a reckoning and an incantation. It's not possible to close such a novel and leave unchanged. Corey, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot for having me, Dan. Thanks to Writers and Books for hosting me tonight. And thanks for Kevin Nguyen for talking to me. And Kevin's book is right here, New Waves. It's wonderful. So please consider checking that out as well. So I'm going to do like a 10 or 15 minute reading. I'm going to read the prologue to the novel, and then Kevin and I will start our conversation. Athletes die twice. That's the hoary, comforting, horrifying mantra that circulates among us ex-jocks, and its meaning should be obvious enough. The muscle and speed, the stamina and quickness you spend your best years building up, the discipline and the single-minded drive, all are bound together by the sport, are you. And as soon as the sport leaves your life, that which united you is gone, and so you are gone too, unraveled like a scarecrow stripped of its stitching. The second you is left to take over, eke out whatever it can before the ultimate death comes. What nobody has ever told me is what happens to that first self after it breathes its last, where the first you goes. Does your living body become a kind of mausoleum for the corpse and you have no choice but to feel it rot away inside? That would explain the terrible stink I've been carrying around the last 10 years. Friend of Stephen? A man asks. It takes me a moment to realize I'm the one being addressed, and another moment to understand that I've been staring. The man is sitting a few stools down the bar. He's 25 maybe, with round-rimmed glasses, close-cropped curly brown hair, and a red Arizona Cardinals jersey whose baggy short sleeves come down to his elbows. He smiles, hands placed expectantly on the bar in anticipation of moving closer. But I have no clue who Stephen is, and zero desire to explain to this man that I hadn't been staring at him so much as at his jersey. I shake my head apologetically and look past him toward the entrance. I usually avoid blind dates, but a colleague in NYU's English department has been nagging me to go out with Horace for months, and this week I finally relented. We agreed to meet here at the Raven, a watering hole indistinguishable from all the others in this stratum of Western Brooklyn. A bar top made of recovered timber, a ceiling of antique hammered tin, light fixtures that are clusters of pendant bulbs with custard-colored filaments. The kind of place where the bearded bartender moodily explains the difference between single barrel and blended, while the television above him plays vintage music videos on loop. Big hair, parachute pants, bold letters that leave a neon residue as they streak onto the screen. Horace arrives. He's about my age, petite and handsome, with a trim black mustache that stands starkly against his pale skin. We shake hands as he takes the stool next to mine, and there's something efficient about him that appeals to me immediately. We run through preliminaries. He's a lawyer, corporate malfeasance. I'm an assistant professor, secularization in 19th century American texts. We have an easy rapport. He's dryly funny and much more confident than I am. And within an hour, we're already reaching back into our pasts. He tells me about the disaster of his parents divorcing when he was 11, the depression and alcoholism that forced him to raise his little brother on his own. As he talks, I sort through my own traumas, trying to decide which one to trade. I'm not precious about sharing this kind of stuff, except for one thing. I don't tell anyone I used to play football or about the events that forced me out of the game. In fact, I've been so disciplined for so long that I've managed to cultivate a whole community here in the city that has no idea what I used to be. The date continues to go well. Our stools have scooted closer. Horace insists I try his Pilsner. I feel happy, buzzed, and am in the middle of explaining the tenure process when a group of men pushes into the bar. Khaki shorts, flip-flops, many of them dressed in Cardinals jerseys, one of them inevitably named Stephen. They gruffly hug the man who tried talking to me, and after some cajoling, they prevail on the bartender to pick up the remote and turn the TV to the Sunday night showdown, Arizona versus Green Bay. Want to go somewhere else? Horace asks, which tells me I'm not hiding my panic very well. No, this is fine. The fans are harmless, as football folks go. They aren't pounding tequila shots or climbing onto the bar, and when one bumps into our stools, he sincerely apologizes rather than calling us faggots with his eyes. But I'm still having trouble concentrating on what Horace is saying, struggling to watch him rather than the game that's flashing in my peripheral vision. Horace himself is growing agitated, and I worry this is my fault until Green Bay scores and the group erupts into boos. With that, Horace sets down his beer, raises his eyes toward the ceiling, and sings out, "Enjoy it while it lasts." The fans don't hear it over the broadcast. Horace sighs and says to me, "That game is dying. Pee-wee enrollment plummeting. Ratings too. The bodies are going to run out, then the money. Nobody's going to even know how to play football in 100 years. And good fucking riddance." Defensiveness rises in me for the game I despise, but speaking out now would only force me to confess everything, so I fake a laugh and clink my glass with Horace's. After taking a sip of his beer, Horace lays his hand on my thigh. He asks again if I want to go somewhere else, except the way he's looking at me signals that somewhere else is no longer a different bar, it's one of our apartments. I say yes, and he smiles and hops off his seat, excusing himself. I watch him walk to the back and join a long bathroom line of full-bladdered Arizona fans. I am fine. I am better than fine, until I look up and see that Rashawn, my Rashawn, is on TV, or at least a photograph of him is. He's wearing dreadlocks these days, designer dreads, short and tight and henna tinted, forming a kind of starburst around his head. He's gotten so muscular that he looks slightly unconvincing, like a sculpture by an also-ran Renaissance artist who mastered individual muscles but lacked the skill to make the muscles cohere into a living, breathing whole. But the eyes work. They're just as I remember them, dark brown, smolderingly intelligent, and I can't believe I'm seeing him, Rashawn. The photograph occupies the top right corner of the screen while a halftime news announcer says, "The legal saga continues between the Seattle Seahawks and Rashawn McCoy. McCoy, a 6-year veteran tailback, was a lock for the starting spot this season when he unexpectedly announced his retirement from football during training camp. The Seahawks have initiated proceedings for breach of contract. McCoy was in the middle of a 3-year, $4 million deal." The announcer moves on to the next item without giving more information. For years, for my health, I've abstained from reading anything about Rashawn, but I can't help myself now and take my phone out to search for mentions. He must have been euphoric when he made the announcement. He must have waited until the worst possible moment to retire just so he could throw his team into chaos. It's over. He's free. The first articles I read focus on the legal battle, but then I land on a more in-depth write-up of what happened. And there, in the second paragraph, is a sentence that makes me feel as if someone has plunged his dirty hands into my gut and roughly flipped my stomach inside out. McCoy's mother died of a treatment-related infection 2 days before the announcement. Heat gathers fast in my eyes. The phone screen starts to blur. An insistent phrase, "It was all for nothing," repeats over and over in my head, pairing with the image I have of Rashawn's mother, an image that's years out of date, an image I know doesn't reflect all the ravages visited on her body since I last saw her. I try to keep the tears at bay by keeping myself perfectly still, like holding a cup filled right to the brim. That's when a hand lands hard on my back. "Have faith, brother." It's the man whose jersey I'd been staring at. He must have been keeping a curious eye on me all this time. Beads of sweat tremble on the top rims of his glasses, and he's so soused that his other hand, the one not resting on my back, is holding on to the bar to steady his wobbly self. "We've got a whole other half to play. Those guys," he lifts his chin scornfully at the television, which has returned to the game and is showing the Green Bay sideline. "They're a bunch of jokers. We'll pull through." Something between a sob and a laugh escapes from me. How could I have expected this moment to go any differently? Horace returns from the bathroom. He sees my eyes are red. "What?" he begins to ask. "He's glass half empty," the drunk exclaims, clapping my back again. "I told him just wait till we get going." "I'm okay," I tell Horace, attempting a smile. The drunk ambles back to his friends, leaving us to try and recover our momentum, but it's no use. Horace gently hints that he knows I'm upset, and I play dumb. I can feel myself going cold, resenting Horace for his solicitude, hating myself for resenting him. Soon we're splitting the tab and stepping out into the warm, clear September night. The air is scented with the rich smoke of a nearby halal cart, and down the slope you can see a tiny Statue of Liberty glowing green in the harbor. "Should we get you a cab?" I ask. "Cab?" he says, mock offended. "That's not what we agreed to." I'm about to say I'm too tired, but before I can, Horace hooks his arm around mine and asks the way to my apartment. I give in and lead him up 9th Street, passing between brownstones and a line of sycamores where invisible insects make insistent clicking noises that put me in mind of a stove burner failing to catch. Horace tries to lighten the mood by telling me why autumn is his favorite season, but I'm only half listening. Maybe my athletic self has not only been rotting away inside me, maybe it's also become a ghost that's going to haunt me for however much time I have remaining. The ghost is the voice that taunts me whenever I lose my wind during a morning jog around Prospect Park. The fingers that mockingly pinch the love handles that sit stubbornly on my hips. The saboteur who finds a way to ruin every single one of my dates. We reach my stoop and climb 2 flights of stairs to my studio. I live in an old brick building that gets stuffy with the day's leftover heat, and I crack the windows before retrieving 2 beers from the fridge. I hand Horace a bottle and join him on my little blue IKEA couch. We sit there in awkward silence, listening to traffic sounds filter into the room from 7th Avenue. Finally, Horace finishes the question he'd started asking back at the bar. "What happened?"
Like no one can clap, right? The funny thing about these Zoom events. That was terrific. Thank you so much for having me, Corey. If for no other reason, it just like gave me a reason to just like reread this like really quickly. Just like personally, like it touches on like 2 specific things that I really like, which are football and a Vietnamese love interest. It was actually funny too, when I was rereading, the prologue really stuck out to me. So I'm kind of glad that you read that first. Because it really, I don't think this gives too much away, but like, I mean, like all good books, like it's even richer and funnier and weirder, like on a second pass, which was very enjoyable for me. But the prologue just like, it just feels so much more tragic when you read it again. I'm just very curious, like when in the writing process, like, did you put the prologue together or did you start there?
That was one of the very last things that I wrote. And that was based on sort of a desire that readers had to know what becomes of Miles and Rashawn in the long term. And by and large, I don't necessarily feel an obligation to fill in those gaps. I think that, if a story is doing its job, like, on the one hand, you're going to feel satisfied enough, but on the other hand, you're never going to feel satisfied, because that's also the job of a story, right? But in this case, I saw their point, in large part because, the book takes place over only a year. We do see in pretty quick succession sort of the maturation of Miles as a football player before he gets to college. But the book is about sort of how, for men in particular, you can have a year like this, and this will deform them or form them for the rest of their lives. And so I saw that I needed to sort of at least give at least a quick sort of view of how the experiences that are detailed in this book sort of ramified in the lives of the two main characters. And so when that happened, I was actually really sort of excited by the suggestion, because it gave me a chance to occupy a perspective that doesn't really ever fully exist in the book, because Miles loves the game, and then his perspective gets more complicated, and by the end of it, he's starting to turn against the game, and sort of his view of it is starting to shift, but it's nowhere near where it is by the time that we're in the prologue. And so another fun thing, if it were just a sort of standard prologue, I don't know if I would have been excited by it, but I've heard the same thing from other readers, where they've said, the book kind of shifts or changes a little bit if you reread the prologue. And so in that way, it's an epilogue that's, sort of been misplaced. And that appealed to me, to have it work in a slightly different way. Yeah.
I think it works extremely well. I'm sort of curious how obviously the idea for the prologue came to you. The book is a lot about sort of like the gaps between where people start and where they end, right? And so then like you just have this, you've like set up this tension really well throughout the entire book. It's just like, how does this guy, because you now know that Miles loathes and is like lightly triggered by football, and then you meet him again, years earlier when he's like, obviously in love with it. Did this idea like come easily to you, or did you try a bunch of things, or?
That that sort of doubleness is something that I just sort of is native to me, because of my own experience with the game. And so I knew where he was by the end of the book, as far as how he felt about the game, and mostly what the prologue nods at is that once you leave football, or once you leave anything that you're passionately engaged with, and that you are either forced out of, or you decide to leave under not ideal circumstances, that you feel ambivalent to start, and then the ambivalence doesn't go anywhere, but it gets sort of crusted over by hatred, and so I knew that that's who he was going to be. And, that's kind of how I am in some ways. I have a lot of sort of surface disdain for the culture and the game and everything like that. But the part of me that loved it, and that, fought so hard to try to excel in it, hasn't gone anywhere. And I've been thinking, this has probably been on your mind too, as a man. I've been thinking about ideas of arrested development for American men, at least, and how we are depicted in popular culture as sort of having a hard stop from a maturation perspective. And it's gotten lampooned, and it's been overdone in any number of ways. But there's another side of it where we're not necessarily incentivized to move on past a certain point. And we only do if we choose to, or if we're forced by circumstances to. But I found, at least in my experience, that I, through, luck and privilege and, lack of luck and any other number of things, have held on to this sort of boy who I was. And he sort of lives uncomfortably in me. And so I was able to extend that to Miles's experience pretty easily. And then when you add the fact that he's gay in this world and that he undergoes the experiences he does, that adds a whole another level of sort of fraughtness for him.
Just quick housekeeping, folks. If you want to ask questions, you can do it in the Q&A thing if someone just did, and in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on it. But I have plenty of questions. So, yeah. So I guess the book is it is about football, but then it's really, I would say, more largely about homophobia and how it relates to toxic masculinity. I guess why did you want to write a book about homophobia?
Yeah, I'm not gay. And so it was in that sense, a conscious choice, to write outside of my experience. That said, if you are in, the football world or any hypermasculine environment and you don't, you're sort of picked out for being odd or not belonging in some way, the automatic, way of, characterizing that person is as being gay. And so it was an experience that I had throughout my football career where, because I was bookish or because of literally sometimes the way that I ran or, something that I'd said, I would get, the bullshit, epithets thrown at me. And it's not that they, wounded me in the way that they would have if I was gay, but it did. What they signaled more than anything was that this is a way that we're going to correct you, to use, a term from The Shining. So this is a way that we're going to signal to you that this step was wrong, that this choice that you made was one that is not approved by our culture. And so, I had a lot of experience with that. And it was as simple, more or less, as I had a really fraught experience with the game. I am not a memoirist, and I can't access whatever those magical people are able to access that allows them to directly write about their experiences. And so I saw Miles's homosexuality as a way of triangulating my own experience, and also of intensifying it and saying, okay, I had these experiences, I had this, set of really unfortunate things happen, and how much more complicated and worse would it have been if, when I was being corrected and being called these epithets, I actually was gay. And so, I can't claim to have necessarily gotten it right. But the leap that I had to make was shorter than it would have been had I, tried to write about someone from a different background.
Yeah, no, that's a smart idea. Just this, you would take sort of the truth, the emotional truth you're trying to get at, and this was the way you could maybe make it the most extreme version of that. Is maybe my understanding.
Right.
And yeah, I think one thing I want to clarify too, for folks that haven't read the book, there is queer love in the book, but I feel the book more largely concerns itself with the oppressive forces, the homophobia. So even though Miles is gay, the book seems more about the forces from outside, and I think you render that really well, and in a complicated way, right? I know we now have a really specific thought of when we think of locker room talk, but there's willing and intentional oppression, and then there's just sort of like the ambient, annoying one.
Yeah.
I thought you got to that really well. I promise I won't ask too many football questions, but one thing
Ask
that
whatever you want.
I there's so much literature, like there's so much high art about like baseball, and then there's so little of it about football, and I wonder like why is that?
And that is a question I've thought about a lot. And I have an essay I even wrote about it, sort of, this super neurotic screed. I think, I think,
novel.
yeah. I think there are several explanations for it. One thing that I'm really interested in is that I think that baseball and fiction had a heyday together, more or less. And so I think if you look, between the 20s and 60s, up into the 70s, baseball was unequivocally the pastime of the United States. And literature was was a very popular, lucrative, form of entertainment.
It's
These
not
were
lucrative now.
if it is, no one's told me. But yeah, so I think that's part of it, and it was just sort of the luck of baseball. But I think more than that, I think that baseball's mechanics just I think people assume that it's just more inherently literary because not a lot happens on, during a given 10-minute stretch during a baseball game. And that allows for the kind of contemplation that novels are really good at. Whereas football is crammed in every sense with incident. And that's really hard to get across narratively. And so I think it's a complexity and a difficulty question. And then another aspect of it, I think, is that, so I think that baseball is just as, and I use this, I use it in a little C sense. I think it's just as conservative as football is, insofar as it embodies certain ideas about the United States and meritocracy in the United States, and of this sort of idyllic idea of people just taking their bat and their gloves out to a sandlot, just sort of communing, and that matches with how people like to view the country. Football's always been dark, and it's always been violent, and it's always had, it's inherently brutal. And I think that form of that idea of America, you would think would be really attractive to writers. I mean, it certainly was to me. But I think it also gets sort of, this is where the class sort of issue and also race comes in, where violence and darkness gets associated with socioeconomic strata, and also with certain ethnic communities that are historically just not sort of written about as often as the communities that we often associate with baseball. And so I think all those things really drove me in a lot of ways, where it's, football has taken over. When football took over, fiction started to decline like pretty precipitously as far as its popularity went. And football came to embody a part of, or a big thrust of the United States that I don't think a lot of people were interested in reading about necessarily. And so I think that's why I think there's like 1.5 great football novels maybe that are actually about the game.
You gotta name them now.
Well, so the main one is A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley, which I think is just absolutely incredible. And I would say the half is probably End Zone by Don DeLillo. There are great books that are about sort of wider football universe. The Throwback Special by Chris Batchelder is a brilliant work, but it's very much about sort of football fans. Billy Lynn's long halftime walk is really good, but that's about
really not about football.
No, yeah, it's about the business sort of like superstructure around football and how it sort of, and football is just sort of like another way of talking about the military for him, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Is the thrilling part of End Zone the little like that middle part that's the game itself?
yeah, you know, and I mean, with DeLillo, he's just in love with the terminology and the figurative sort of nature of football, and so like he gets it, sort of the football life fine. But what's really special about that book is how he sees that the language of football and the language of nuclear warfare, you know, are very sort of sympathetic in a lot of ways. So anyway, like I said, I could rant about this.
Yeah, it's just very DeLillo. It's like very smart. It's very on the nose. And yeah, like the middle of this book is just like detailing probably like maybe just one half of a game.
Right.
But it actually, it came to mind when I was reading the end of the Redshirt. And it was interesting to me too. Like I was curious like what your answer to this would be, because I think it must be just, it's hard to describe a football game because so much is going on. And like, I think the longest description of a football game you have is actually like, you know, your point of view character observing it, not playing it.
Right.
And I wondered if that was like a narrative choice or just a practical choice.
It's, you know, I'll have to be careful not to spoil the ending of this to talk about that specific scene. But just like sort of pulling back about like the scene of a given football play and of sort of the wider like football world. You know, there are 22 people on the field. There are all the refs. There are, you know, in college football, you can get 75 or more players on a given sideline. And so I think that, you know, some people might be turned off by just how many sort of moving parts you have. But I found it really cool to sort of very selectively kind of intervene in the narrative and sort of describe it. Yeah, I'm trying to, so what you're talking about is there's a scene in which Miles watches a whole game. And we watch him and he tells us about watching this game. And you know, I think a big part of the book is about Miles's distance from the game. Even when he's enmeshed in it, and even when, you know, you wouldn't think that anyone could be any more deeply integrated into the football world than Miles is. And yet, because of his homosexuality, because of his, so, you know, another important sort of development for him is he develops intellectually over the course of the book. And that itself becomes sort of a wedge between him and a lot of the team, not necessarily because football players aren't smart. Football players are really smart. You have to be to operate at a certain level, but football players' intelligence gets marshaled toward a very specific, very kind of gnomic, you know, world and set of tasks. And Miles's mind kind of strays outside of that circumference. And that's why he ends up becoming friends is not quite the word with Rashawn, but he starts to understand Rashawn because Rashawn, to a much greater extent, wants to exist as an intelligent human being outside of the intelligence of football.
We have a question from Allison that kind of leads back to an earlier thing you said. Will you say that arrested development of American males is a metaphor for our adolescent country?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at least for
Easy.
At least for the men. Yeah. Super simple. Yeah, for men, I think that it's, you know, I think that we, from a day-to-day obligation standpoint, any number of perspectives, I think we ask women to mature earlier and more comprehensively than we do men in a lot of cases. And that's not to say that men don't have any number of burdens that are, grown-up burdens and mature burdens, but the way that we process the stresses of those burdens and the way that we try to articulate ourselves in that burdensome world, for a lot of men is stuck in sort of an adolescent vocabulary. There was a Washington Post article that came out maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and it was about how men were having a particularly hard time in one respect during the pandemic, because their sole source of socializing, whether it was going to watch a football game or, they had, just a few activities, were cut off, and they did not have the emotional and intellectual sort of resources to fall back on to the same extent that a lot of women do. And I don't want to overgeneralize here, but
football was still on.
yeah, exactly. But football, if you go into a bar, all the men watching football, probably 95% of them couldn't explain the game in a sophisticated or interesting way, because they're not actually there for it. They're there for each other. And there's a deep sort of social aspect to those gatherings that has very little to do with the game. And what's amazing about it is, even though they're there for each other, the language they use is so constricted and so stunted in a lot of ways, and it falls back on you use statistics that you're talking about, or you use jibes that you're giving your buddy or whatever it is, and like you're not grunting exactly, but in a lot of cases, like, people go to those settings because they want the ability to not have to look at one another while also enjoying and sharing in each other's sort of like warmth, And I just explained essentially every single gathering of men, that I've been a part of, in any number.
We're doing okay, are we?
Yeah, but yeah. So yeah, no, I think you should extend it in that sort of macro sense to the country.
Mm-hmm. Allison, that's a great question. I've just got a couple more, and we're going to wrap up pretty quickly. But if you guys have questions, just get them in now. We'll get to them. Oh yeah, my favorite question. Why did you make the Tao character Vietnamese?
I needed his name to be difficult for Miles to pronounce, and he comes from Colorado and is from a place in Colorado where he's not gonna know how to say when. I just made a terrible pun there. I didn't even need to make. So that was part of it. And, I spent a year in Southeast Asia. And so that's just a name that sort of, I don't know. In a separate conversation, we can talk about how the hell you figure out names for all the people in your book. But for whatever reason, it was just sort of floating around. And then another aspect was, I was sort of interested in someone who, because Miles' love interest's father, fled the war, and so I liked the contrast between someone who, Miles would think would be a lot less rooted and a lot less sure of himself, but who is infinitely more confident, who's out as Miles isn't. And so I wanted to sort of, very briefly, and I don't get into this, super deeply in the book, but, Miles would have thought that, he is, American, so-called, and, can only look back, several generations and see more Americans. And he would think that he'd have a better sort of grip on himself and on this country and what this country wants from him. And it's not the case at all. And so, I think the combination of, having the win sort of floating around, and then also the context that his father came from sort of gave me a chance to sort of juxtapose him with Miles.
Yeah, just like a little context if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet. Tao's character has the same last name as mine that gets mispronounced as Gwen, which becomes like a big recurring thing, which it's very tragic in the book, but I actually thought it was like very funny in the moment. Before I saw like what it mutated to and how it affected Miles's life.
Right. And and it was also, the other thing really quickly is football culture is a brilliant engine of linguistic innovation. Like the words that football players come up with and the nicknames that they create are just so sophisticated and fascinating. And I think another part of it was like, oh, how can I use the mispronunciation of his last name as a way to also explore masculinity in the culture, which happens when the mispronunciation gets weaponized.
Yeah, there's also, and maybe it's something you maintain as well, but like there are people that like, you kind of made this distinction earlier. There are people like that watch football, and then there are people like actually know what football is, or actually know what's going on. And I think that divide is so big. I think you're really frustrated by this party of people, right? Like they just like the violence.
Yes.
Because like football is like probably the most complicated sport. It's like the only thing where you have to do like literal studying when you between practice, right?
Yeah.
It's the only sport like that. And I like that's in the book. That energy is in the book.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, while we wrap up here, what are you working on next?
I am working with our wonderful agent, Sarah, on a new book that's about, let's just say it's about the great state of Colorado. So yeah. So Miles is, people haven't read it. Miles is from Colorado, and we don't spend a lot of time there, but I spent a decent amount of time there. I was born there, and a lot of my family's from there. And so the new book is about what a unusual, intense place Colorado is.
Cool. Well, I'm excited to read that when it's ready. And then for everyone that hasn't gotten the Redshirt yet, I think Dan dropped the link in the chat. So definitely buy it.
Kevin's book too.
I can't believe you showed my book before I could show your book. Like that's just terrible self-promo, Corey. This is your event. Cool. Well, this is so much fun. Thank you for having me. And thanks everyone for showing up.
Oh, thanks for doing this, Kevin. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Is Dan going to take back over, or do we do like an awkward goodbye kind of thing?
He's back.
I'm back. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you to Corey. Thank you to Kevin. Buy their books. If you've missed previous readings, including this reading, will be up on our website as videos. So you can check that out at wab.org. And I just want to thank everyone for coming, and have a great night.
Thanks a lot, Dan.